Imperial Presidency, and I want to jump right on in. When you think of the term imperial, it usually signifies someone with great importance and a lot of power. And if you go back in American history, we will see time periods where the president has exercised tremendous amounts of power. The president that I would probably highlight the most in this is going to be FDR. When he comes into office, he has massive problems in front of him, the Great Depression, and eventually World War II. And he will be the leader of the nation and will really transform how we live. One of the things, though, that allows him to do this is going to be mass media again. And he starts with the fireside chats, and eventually we will transition to television. And what will happen is the American public will get used to seeing one person speak for the nation as opposed to the 535 people in Congress. And presidents, ever since the growth of mass media, have really seen their power grow tremendously. So we've always looked at the president to try to do things, but and many times the president did a lot of good things. But this lesson's going to be looking a little bit at some of the negatives also. So let's take a look here. In the wake of Vietnam and Watergate, Congress really started to worry about this concept of the imperial presidency. Arthur Schlesinger, a famous author, a presidential historian, wrote a book called The Imperial Presidency, and he said, you know, presidential power has grown excessive. It's imperial. It should be scaled back. Theodore Lowery, professor at Cornell, he came back and he said, well, yeah, it's a lot, but it's necessary. Economic growth has made it so that we need a strong executive branch. And really, if you want to blame anybody, blame Congress, because Congress keeps delegating powers to the executive branch, especially when it comes to foreign policy. They pretty much let the executive branch do what they want. Schlesinger would come back and say, well, I've got some examples of too much power for the president, places where he's probably gone too far. Obviously, when it comes to war powers, there is a constitutional conflict. Congress is the only group that can declare war. The president is a commander-in-chief. Today is December the 29th, 2014, and literally this morning I was watching news, and they said, today brings an end to America's longest war, our war in Afghanistan. And I stood there for a moment and said, wait a second, that's a conflict. We have not declared war. Only Congress can declare war, and there was no declaration of war against Afghanistan. So even the term war today is kind of a vague term. We have lots of conflicts, and as we've talked about already, last time we actually had a, quote, war was World War II. But this does present a problem. What powers, when it comes to troops and to funding, does Congress have versus the president? Historically, if you go back to the 18th century, you know, you didn't have to worry about an imminent attack. I mean, let's be realistic. If someone wanted to attack you, they had to get on boats and sail across a gigantic ocean to try to launch an attack. You had time to figure out what you wanted to do. Today, that's very different. With intercontinental ballistic missiles and all kinds of amazing technology, literally we could be attacked instantaneously. So we have looked and said, you know what, Congress, you may have some powers, but you're not quick enough to respond. We need a single person to respond, and that has become the president. Presidents nowadays have sent troops lots of places without congressional approval. Now, before I click on this link, I have to tell you, the person who wrote this definitely has a point of bias. He thinks that the U.S. is way too active in military affairs of other nations. I show you this just to give you an example of how often U.S. troops actually do get involved in things. And most of the time, they're small skirmishes, but it happens a lot more than you think. So this one goes post-World War II. And sometimes it's just a threat. We look at an adversary and say, if you don't leave, we will blow you up. Now, we could do that for about 5 years after World War II because we had the atomic bomb and the Soviets did not. But there are going to be several in here where it becomes a hot issue. It is no longer an issue of the United States threatening someone, but actually moving troops in. Korea, and you'll say it says 51 to 53 with a question mark, because although we are not fighting in Korea anymore, there has never been a peace treaty, and they are still, tensions rise up all the time over there. But there you've got Korea, 51 to 53. This was when the French were in charge of Vietnam after World War II, and there was a battle called the Battle of Dien Bien Phu. And during that battle, we thought about dropping nukes to stop the North Vietnamese. We chose not to. Uh, one of the big criticisms a lot of countries have about the United States is that our CIA has been involved in aiding people who are attempting to overthrow governments that we may not be in favor of. You can see naval troops and naval forces in Lebanon in 58. Going to move on there. Vietnam from 1960, starting with military advisors, all the way to our pullout in 1975. Cuba, 61. This was the CIA trying to help in the Bay of Pigs invasion. This was Cuba 62's, the Cuban Missile Crisis. Moving on again, there were a couple others I wanted to hit pretty quickly. Cambodia was a horrible one. Iran, the first time, this was when Americans were held hostage in Iran, and we tried to rescue them. It was the end of the Carter presidency, and it was a rescue gone horribly bad. El Salvador, we were helping anti-war rebels down there and basically breaking congressional law. Nicaragua, another example. This was one of the happy moments for the United States. Grenada, Cuba decided to invade this place, and we sent our military in and got them out really quickly and all celebrated. Let's go with, we'll do Panama, 89. That was a good one also. That was getting out Manuel Noriega. Noriega had been the leader of Panama, and we had suspected that he had been helping traffic cocaine. And we went down there, and he wanted to run for it and went to go hide in a church. And rather than blow up the church, the U.S. found out that Noriega hated heavy metal music. So we basically set up large speakers and played like Iron Maiden and Black Sabbath and AC/DC. And within a day, he surrendered, was arrested, tried, and convicted, and spent 25 years in a U.S. prison. But you can see there's lots and lots of examples where the U.S. has gone into other countries, either using force or using the threat of force to try to achieve goals. And you can see on there it said Iraq 2003 to, well, that would be 2012, and now Afghanistan 2001, and we just got out today. So it's been an interesting time. So if you look at this, you will see the U.S. has been involved quite often in the affairs of other countries. Congress, in almost all of these cases, basically says go for it. Even if members of Congress disagree, the biggest power Congress has is funding them. But the reality is, once the president moves troops someplace, we as a public tend to support that decision because we support our troops. And if Congress didn't fund it, it would be Congress's fault if an American soldier died, and there's no way they're not going to fund it. So once troops move, we tend to go and support the troop movement regardless. Now, well, that's pretty much what I was saying. Now, one of the other pieces why Congress does not declare war, if there was an actual declaration of war, we put tremendous amounts of power into the hands of president because at this point, we are literally trying to survive as a nation. And so we look at the president and say, please lead us, please save us. And we would transform our nation from a peacetime to a wartime. That also means Congress would take a side, to basically move off to the side. And the president, for lack of a better term, would almost become a dictator. Congress doesn't want to see that happen, so we no longer declare war. Now, as I just said, if we did, what does it mean? Quick examples, and these are big. This is a major changes in how we would live. In a time of war, or if there's a great emergency, the president can suspend habeas corpus. Habeas corpus is your right to be able to brought in front of a judge and informed of the charges against you. In 2006, Congress passed the Military Commissions Act, which allowed the President of the United States, and only the President of the United States, to identify individuals as what are called enemy combatants. And those individuals can be held indefinitely without being charged with a crime and define what it is and what it is not. This is an amazing amount of power for the president, and he can do this to people who are U.S. citizens. So the suspension of habeas corpus is one. Second, censorship of the mail. This goes back to World War I, and basically during a time of war, we can pretty much read any transmission to see what is being said to make sure that the nation is not at risk. Now, back in World War I, when letters went out, they would basically black things out. Today, it would be very interesting if there was censorship of the mail because most people don't write letters, they use email or text. Would the U.S. government be able to block messages that were being sent because they felt that it contained some sort of message that could be detrimental to the well-being of the troops or the war effort? And if they were allowed to do that, the bigger question would be, how would they do that? And how would they know what to block and not block? Control of manufacturing. You may not think of this, so this is a biggie. When it comes down to control of manufacturing, you literally can have the U.S. government come in and say, hey, you were building cars, today you're building tanks. We will look at manufacturers and change them around and make sure that they produce the weapons and the military supplies we need for war. That's more important than anything. Control of communication. Eavesdropping. It's been around for a long time, and it continues today. In an earlier lecture, I talked to you about warrantless wiretaps and that they are constitutional. There is a court that is called the FISA court. The FISA court gives out warrants. FISA courts are America's secret courts, and they will allow for for example, they will allow for law enforcement to go into someone's house without a warrant, look for things, and come out, and they can issue warrants up to 48 hours after the fact. FISA courts have an amazing amount of power. We, as American public, will not know what they actually have done. The one thing the FISA courts release each year is a number of requests for warrants and the number that were granted, and that's all they actually release. So a lot of power given to government, especially after 9/11. Moving on, control of transportation. Uh, if you, it was in here, yeah. What we basically say is we're going to take your business, whether it be railway, airplanes, whatever, shipping. We will pay you what you made previously, like you're not going to go bankrupt, but you're not moving tourists, you're going to be moving soldiers. And the U.S. government can take control of transportation because, once again, it is a war effort. This is one hopefully we will not see, but it is martial law. And martial law basically means the Constitution is suspended. Habeas corpus is suspended. Everything is suspended. The president has the ability to declare martial law in a time of war or invasion, but that's about the extent of it. We have seen some examples where forms of martial law have been declared. Probably the most recent was back in 2005 when Hurricane Katrina hit Louisiana. And the governor, they didn't call it martial law. They had another term for it. I think it was just emergency, state of emergency. But for all intents and purposes, it's martial law, where officers are told that there's tell the civilians there's a curfew from sundown to sunrise, that anything that's out after that can be shot. You do not have a right to be out, that you can be detained at any point in time for the safety of society as a whole. So martial law is another major power the president could have in a time of war. Now, moving on, why would we look at this idea of the imperial presidency? And this is really an interesting one, and I need to make sure you understand this concept. It's a major concept. We have and have had for many years what are called treaties, and treaties are agreements between nations. So the United States and Britain might go and enter into a treaty. And a treaty is a binding agreement that must be ratified, at least on our side, by the U.S. Senate. And when a treaty is ratified, you need 2/3 of the Senate to ratify that treaty. So it's a big deal. Treaties do not come with expiration dates. Now, there is another thing that has been used by presidents, and it is called executive agreements. And as you're about to see on this chart, the number of executive agreements has grown quite a bit over time. An executive agreement is an agreement between the leaders of two nations. So it would be like the agreement between the leader of the US and the leader of Britain. They stay in effect only as long as both leaders are still in power. If leadership changes, the next person who comes in could seek to continue the executive agreement or not. The key with executive agreements is they are not subject to Senate approval. The Senate has no say in these, and that's a big difference. What you'll see, looking at that list a moment ago, is that the number of executive agreements has gone up tremendously. From 1933 to 1998, there were over 14,000 executive agreements. From 1789 all the way to 1932, there had only been 1,000. We are dramatically increasing the number of executive agreements, and we're not doing treaties. Now, why aren't we doing treaties? Well, we come back to that concept of divided government. It's hard to get things done. And when you need a supermajority of 2/3 of the Senate to agree to something, it's even harder. What it becomes weird is there are times where an executive agreement would be much more important and could have much longer term consequences for the United States than treaties. For example, there was a treaty a couple years ago that the United States signed with Mexico. And this treaty, ratified by the U.S. Senate, said that if we discovered in our museums stolen artifacts from Mexico's history, we would return those artifacts. Now, I'm not arguing for or against it, but that's not the most pressing of issues probably for the United States of America. That was a treaty. Um, I would argue one of the most famous executive agreements of all time was the Atlantic Charter between Roosevelt and Churchill, where we basically met and laid the groundwork for U.S. involvement in World War II and what our vision was going to be after the war. The idea that you had these two leaders coming to agreements about what to do in and after war, and there was no Senate involvement in that agreement, should give you some ideas to the power of an executive agreement. Now, our next term is one that's also a very important one. It is called executive privilege. Executive privilege is the right of the president to not divulge conversations between himself and his advisors. He gets to keep them secret. What presidents say is that if they didn't have the power to do that, they would not get good advice. There have been some controversies about it. For example, Karl Rove, who we've mentioned earlier, was an advisor for President Bush. And there was, I can't say it was a scandal, a controversy, I guess would be the better term, about some U.S. attorneys that were fired and what role Karl Rove may have played in the firing of these U.S. attorneys. And the Senate Judiciary Committee said, we would like Karl Rove to testify and tell us what he knows about the firing of these attorneys, U.S. attorneys. President Bush invoked executive privilege, and he said, Karl Rove is protected by executive privilege because he is part of my office, and therefore did not have to testify. Um, Another example, and I think it might even be a better one, Dick Cheney, who was vice president under President Bush, Dick Cheney met with executives of energy companies, mainly oil businesses, to develop an energy policy for the United States early in President Bush's first term. Well, there were a lot of groups, in particular environmental groups, who wanted to know what went on in those discussions, what was spoken about in formulating energy policy. Oil companies might have one view of energy policy, whereas environmental groups might have a different group. And they sued to gain access to the minutes of that meeting, what was said. The Supreme Court ruled that President Bush had the right to give executive privilege to Vice President Cheney because energy policy could easily be part of national security. And when you have national security issues, the president can easily use executive privilege to try to protect the nation. Um, so critics claim presidents have abused that under the guise of national security. Probably the most famous example of that was Richard Nixon while he was president, where he tried to keep the tapes from the White House secret because he did not want people to hear about his involvement or his administration's involvement in Watergate. And what the Supreme Court said is, sorry, President Nixon, you can't use executive privilege here because it is not national security. However, if it was, you would have a legal right to use executive privilege. So the big thing about executive privilege to remember is it allows presidents to keep conversations between themselves and their advisors and others who work under them confidential, especially when it applies to national security. All right, our last part, and this has been an interesting one historically, is called impoundment. The definition, the refusal of the president to spend money that has been appropriated by Congress. The most common use of impoundment is after a war. You budget for the full year for the war, and the war ends when you drop the atomic bomb in August. Because the war has come to an end, you will not need to fight it in September, October, November, or December, even though you budgeted for war for those months. So you would take the money that was supposed to go to the war and not spend it on war, but spend it on other things. That was the usual usage of impoundment. However, President Nixon used it a different way. What Nixon did is he would have a bill come to him and he would sign the bill into law. And when you sign a bill, you sign the entire bill. All parts of it weigh equally and become law. Well, there would be parts of a bill that President Nixon would not like. So what he did is he would refuse to fund areas that he did not like. That is a different usage of impoundment and was challenged in the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court ruled that you cannot do that for those purposes. So you can't impound money specifically for a program. In many ways, that would be what we would call a line item veto. And speaking of veto, we'll use the last one here, the use of the veto. The threat of a veto from a president is an amazing amount of power. We're probably going to see it in the next 2 years. President Obama will have, during his last 2 years in office, a Republican House and a Republican Senate. They are going to be very well aware that if they send legislation to him that he is vehemently opposed to or even mildly opposed to, that he can veto it, and there's not much they can do because the odds of them getting a 2/3 vote in the House and Senate to override his veto is very, very slim, especially with the polarization that is out there today. So what winds up happening is the president can look and say, if you think this should be law, here are the changes you need to make to get me to sign it. If you don't make the changes, I'm not going to sign it. And historically, 93% of vetoes stand. So basically, if the president says no, it's more than likely going to be no. So that, again, gives the president amazing amounts of power. All right, so that brings this lecture to an end, and I will see you all soon.